When the first recorded execution took place in 1513, some people loved it, while others hated it. It seemed as if capital punishment has been debated for as long as it's been around, but 500 years later, it remains as rock solid as the government itself. Texas has been famous for the highest rate of executions of any state or colony in history, with a whopping 1,263 executions since 1819. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice reports that there are 275 convicted criminals currently awaiting execution. Of those, only 9 are women and 167 are black. Considering that only 13% of the United States population is black, while 64% of inmates on death row are black, do we really have the luxury of entertaining the thought that these convictions are all just? A recent study of the death penalty in Texas shows that the current capital punishment system is an outgrowth of the racist legacy of slavery. Between 1930 and the end of 1996, 4,226 prisoners were executed in the U.S., more than half were black. Capital punishment is a lot more humane now than it was 500 years ago. The traditional mode of execution, hanging, is an option still available in Delaware, New Hampshire, and Washington. Death on the gallows is easily bungled. If the drop is too short, there will be a slow and agonizing death by strangulation. If the drop is too long, the head will be torn off. 2 states, Idaho and Utah, still authorize a firing squad. The prisoner is strapped into a chair and hooded. A target is pinned to the chest. 5 marksmen, 1 with blanks, take aim and fire. Throughout the 20th century, electrocution has become the most widely used form of execution in this country, and is still utilized in 11 states. The condemned prisoner is led into the death chamber, strapped into the chair, and strains, jolting as the voltage is raised and lowered. Electrodes are fastened to the head and legs, and once the switch is thrown, smoke rises from the head. There is the awful odor of burning flesh. No one truly knows how long electrocuted individuals retain consciousness. The introduction of the gas chamber was an attempt to improve on electrocution, but that failed as well. In 1996, a panel of judges on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California, where the gas chamber has been used since 1933, ruled that this method is a cruel and unusual punishment. The latest mode of enacting the death penalty, enacted into law by more than 30 states, is lethal injection. It is easy to overstate the humaneness and efficacy of this method. One cannot truly know whether lethal injection is really painless, yet there is evidence that it is not. As the U.S. Court of Appeals observed, there is substantial and uncontroverted evidence that execution by lethal injection poses a serious risk of cruel, protracted death. Even a slight error in dosage or administration can leave a prisoner conscious but paralyzed while dying, a sentient witness of his or her own asphyxiation. The forms of execution have evolved along with society, but what society failed to recognize was the basic human rights violated in 1997 on Mr. Duane Buck.
In 1997, Duane Buck was convicted of killing Deborah Gardner and Kenneth Butler, and critically wounding his stepsister, Phyllis Taylor.
Buck's lawyers are asking the justices to set aside his death sentence because the jury in his case was told he was more dangerous to society because he was black. There is
Dr. Walter Quijano, a psychologist, said when he was questioned at Buck's trial that the fact that Buck is black means that Buck is a danger to society. This fact alone, said Quijano, warrants capital punishment.
Did you remember that specific question when he talked about you being more likely to be a danger because you're black?
Yeah, I mean, out of all the things, that stood out because it's like he basically saying because you're black, you need to die, right? And I felt that was strange because my lawyer didn't say nothing, and nobody else, the prosecutor or the judge, and nobody did. It's like it was an everyday thing in the court.
I think it's hard to underestimate how powerful that testimony is. You have a psychologist, an expert in the field, testifying that the person who was on trial was going to be dangerous in the future. This was a case that did not have an enormous amount of evidence speaking to the question of future dangerousness. Mr. Buck did not have prior convictions for violence. So having this expert in the field say that because of his race, he was going to be dangerous in the future, it clearly had a very profound impact on the jury.
And now to a controversial court case. Former Governor Mark White is speaking out in defense of a convicted killer on death row.
Governor Mark White, who held office during the executions of 19 convicted felons, believes one man on death row needs more time to live, convicted murderer Duane Buck.
It's unfair to have someone on death row if they're not supposed to be there. This is getting in front of the problem. Don't wait till it's too late.
It is so inflammatory that it is beyond reason to me to believe that it did not influence at least some of the jurors. So it does nothing but appeal to bias, that if there's a bias lurking within someone, this kind of evidence is meant to get that out.
Harris County has had a history of courtroom discrimination, which is what likely influenced Buck's trial. A study conducted between 1992 and 2001, a time period that includes Buck's case, found that the Harris County DA's office was over 3 times more likely to seek the death penalty against African American defendants, like Duane Buck, than against white defendants. And Harris County juries were more than twice likely to impose death sentences on African American defendants like Mr. Buck. In Harris County, it seemed as if racial discrimination had become the social norm in courts, and although Duane Buck was a married man and a family man, his execution was scheduled to take place in 2006. A series of appeals has delayed it.
Mr. Buck is an incredible individual. He's different than any other client I've met on death row. His faith and his spirit are infectious and inspiring. And now that he's on death row and has had time to reflect on his crime, he's incredibly sad and remorseful about what he's done. And he's dedicated himself to God and to preaching to those other inmates on death row who are looking for guidance.
Duane Buck's exemplary behavior while on death row once again proves the fallacy that Dr. Quijano's biased testimony reveals. In Buck's 14 years in prison, he was not once written up for bad behavior, even in Harris County's infamously strict jails, where prisoners are written up for minor offenses, like not shaving. Duane Buck, through testimony of fellow inmates and guards, serves as a role model who has formed peaceful relationships in the county jail. Buck has said that he takes full responsibility for the actions that led to the tragic deaths of Deborah Gardner and Kenneth Butler.
I'm asking everyone for them to forgive me. It's been really painful for me, but for me, over the years, think about what had happened, what I did. I think about everybody else, even the people that I don't know, right? I pray every day that God will give them peace in their heart where they can forgive me, and I ask for their forgiveness.
Duane Buck, in 1997, was put on death row because of the testimony of a racially biased psychologist, and his exemplary prison record and plea for forgiveness have been ignored by the Texas justice system. Is not the right to life an inalienable right cited in the Declaration of Independence? Yet the Duane Buck case should cause us to stop and ask whether the inalienable rights guaranteed to all citizens of the U.S. are being executed in our courts.
Each time that I visit him, the first thing he says is, "How you doing? Please forgive me for the pain that I have caused you."
When we apply the death penalty and we seek criminal sentences, we have to do so in a colorblind manner. And allowing this kind of racial testimony in any capital sentence proceeding undermines the entire justice process.
Join me and more than 100 civil rights leaders, clergy, former prosecutors, and judges in calling for a new and fair sentencing hearing for Duane Buck. Tell Texas to keep its promise.